Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Thursday, everybody. My apologies in advance. I've had to move into a separate room to record for today, and there is a bit of an echo. I hope this is not too distracting. Let's begin. Taiwan's election is just 2 days away. We continue to follow the coverage in the lead up to this geopolitical flashpoint event. In an exclusive report published today, UK-based The Financial Times writes that US President Joe Biden plans to send a high-level delegation of former officials to Taipei after the election in Taiwan on Saturday. Quote, in a move that could complicate efforts by the US and China to stabilize their strained relationship. End quote. According to 5 unnamed people, the White House has tapped James Steinberg, a former Democratic Deputy Secretary of State, and Stephen Headley, a former Republican National Security Advisor, to lead the bipartisan delegation. One former US official told the outlet that Biden's decision to send the delegation to Taipei so soon after the election was a risky move that could backfire. Quote, the paramount US goal at this sensitive time should be to encourage restraint by both Beijing and Taipei. Sending such a high-level delegation looks like a bear hug to Taipei, giving Beijing cover to overreact. We need more subtle actions to be effective. End quote. Another person familiar with the trip said that it was a bad idea given the risk that both Taipei and Beijing could use it to push their own agendas in different ways that would complicate policy for Washington. Meanwhile, Taiwan-based Taipei Times writes that Beijing is mass-posting videos featuring a false secret history of President Tsai Ing-wen on hundreds of social media accounts. Quote, in a disinformation push ahead of Saturday's presidential election. End quote. The secret history of Tsai Ing-wen is a 300-page document containing rumors and negative content first published last month. The material, the outlet reports, is being turned into hastily produced videos with artificial intelligence-generated voiceovers and fake hosts, and posted on YouTube, Instagram, X, and other platforms. An unnamed national security official reportedly told the outlet, quote, the content's creation and spread bore the characteristic traits of an information operation by the Chinese Ministry of State Security. End quote. There is more drama for the front-running DPP this week too. Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post reports that a leaked, unverified recording, purportedly of President Tsai Ing-wen and the ruling party legislator discussing an apparent divide within the organization has been dismissed by the lawmaker as interference by, quote, foreign forces, end quote. In a piece called China Heaps Pressure on Taiwan Ahead of a Big Election, UK-based The Economist writes this week that on the 1st of January, Beijing reimposed tariffs on 12 petrochemical products that had been covered under a cross-strait trade deal, the so-called Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement. We covered this at the time. Quote, the 12 restricted items account for a tiny proportion of Taiwan's total exports to China, but things could get worse. China is mulling whether to do away with other portions of the ECFA and perhaps the whole thing. China remains Taiwan's biggest export market. End quote. The opposition parties want to build on this trade agreement. However, frontrunner DPP's William Lai wishes to lessen Taiwan's reliance on the Chinese market even more. If he wins, The Economist argues, the two economies will probably move further apart. Quote, while the prospects of peaceful unification dim. End quote. The voting will take place this Saturday, and all voting must take place in person in Taiwan, a decades-old rule designed to prevent mainland interference. Quote, it is hard to hack a system based on popular ballots placed in a box that are counted that afternoon with the public welcome to watch. The more Taiwan moves away from this straightforward system, the more it opens up the possibility for diminished trust in election results. End quote. It's a great pleasure to help China Update viewers understand developments in China from a holistic and macro level. but it's hard to get this level of diverse coverage for areas and countries I am not as familiar with. Regular viewers know that I use Ground News as a tool to overcome this challenge. That's why it's awesome that Ground News has asked to sponsor the channel. Ground News combines local and international news from around the world in one place so readers can compare coverage and access additional context like who owns each source and their political affiliation. Let me show you how it works. I saw a story about the EU talks with China from a topic I followed called German economy. It shows the most current stories related to this topic and a quick breakdown of which outlets are reporting on this and a media bias breakdown. As you can see, Ground News provides links to relevant articles to the story from left, center, and right outlets. I can even see which outlets I'm reading, a great way to know the makeup of the news I'm consuming and being aware of any ideological blind spots. This has led me to discover new outlets and furthered my awareness of the biases behind sources I'm already familiar with. Ground News is my main method to keeping up to date with countries and topics I'm less familiar with, and I highly encourage it to be yours too. Go to ground.news/China update to check it out. You can subscribe through my link for less than $1 a month or get 30% off unlimited access to the Vantage subscription, which is what I use. A big thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this episode of China Update. Next up, according to a report released on Tuesday by the Beijing-based Center for Forecasting Science at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, China's economy is forecast to maintain steady growth in 2024, with an estimated GDP growth rate of around 5.3%. The growth this year, the report claims, would be driven by domestic consumption and investment by 3.7 percentage points and 1.9 percentage points respectively, but dragged down 0.3 percentage points by exports. This is much more optimistic than other forecasts. The World Bank expects weak sentiment and heightened economic uncertainty to weigh on consumption, with weak investment growth due to continued pain in the property sector. Swiss investment bank UBS predicts China's economy will grow 4.4% this year, as the base effects from the post-COVID recovery fade and the property downturn continues to drag. Fitch Ratings predicts 4.6% in 2024, calling 2023 a, quote, temporary boost from the reopening, end quote. Indeed, the World Bank thinks that this year will be very bad globally generally. In a recent Global Economic Prospects report, the Washington-based international financial institution expressed, quote, barring a major course correction, the world is headed for the weakest economic growth performance of any half-decade since the 1990s. End quote. But this Beijing-based think tank disagrees when it comes to China. Hong Yongmiao, director of the center, expressed in the report, quote, we are confident in China's economic development. A recovery in growth is expected from the real economy to the service industry, among which the service industry is likely to recover at the fastest pace. Emerging industries such as new materials and new energy will also develop rapidly. End quote. Now, regular viewers know that the economy has become a sensitive political topic and that Beijing has signaled to the system that positive energy must be produced on this front this year. But there is something else to note too. Quote, as long as the country has debt capacity, China can get any GDP growth it likes simply by expanding the debt needed to fund whatever amount of non-productive investment required to achieve the growth target. That's why it seems to me that in China, GDP growth projections are not terribly useful, except to the extent that they come with the associated debt projections. The goal should not be to maximize economic activity, but rather to maximize sustainable growth. End quote. Next up, we have two more important developments to cover. I hope you're enjoying today's episode. If you're getting some value from this episode, I only have one ask. That is to like and subscribe. This is the primary way in which this channel grows. The main way it is shown to new people is if the algorithm is happy. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, an interesting development which we briefly take note of. This week, an academic with the War Studies College of the Academy of Military Sciences in the People's Liberation Army has penned a piece about the threat posed to China's national security by Elon Musk's Starlink, arguing that, quote, it will significantly impact space strategic stability intensify the space arms race, and have negative implications for space security and governance." End quote. The piece is called "Accelerated US Starlink Threatens Space Security," and we quote a few excerpts to get a feel for how Chinese military strategists are thinking about this topic. Quote, "In regional conflicts, Starlink satellites help establish a strike chain to support ground forces in combat thanks to its advantages such as rapid deployment, flexible networking, and reliability. Additionally, SpaceX announced plans to launch 15,000 Starshield satellites to support the establishment of a rapid, closed kill chain by the United States military. The Starlink project can provide global network communication, military reconnaissance, and space confrontation capabilities, and serve as a crucial lever for the US to achieve space dominance. First, Starlink has a clear military focus and strategic intentions. The US is intensifying its deployment of Starlink to strengthen its operational capabilities and deterrent advantages, obtain the competitive advantage as a major power from the offensive and defensive pattern, confrontation situation, and power balance, and undermine the stability of space strategy. Second, Starlink occupies a significant amount of space frequency resources. It has further intensified the global competition for low Earth orbit resources and initiated a new round of space arms race. Third, the high-density deployment of Starlink project poses a serious risk to the security of space assets of various countries and affects the normal operation of satellites from other nations. In addition, the Starshield satellites can undertake suicide missions against space vehicles and carry weapon payloads for space strike missions, which poses a threat to space security. End quote. As we can see, military strategists in China are deeply concerned about the US's competitive advantage in this emerging space industry. Finally for today, 3 authors have published a paper in the latest issue of China Quarterly called "Do Chinese Citizens Conceal Opposition to the CCP in Surveys? Evidence from 2 Experiments." The paper seeks to critique the claim that, quote, "over 90% of Chinese citizens support the government," end quote. This is a claim which Beijing often cites. It's from a Harvard University survey among the Chinese population spanning 13 years, which purportedly found that more than 90% of respondents are satisfied with the party and their government. This paper challenges this assertion, however, explaining that most public opinion research in China uses direct questions to measure support for the party and government policies. These direct question surveys routinely find that over 90% of Chinese citizens support the government. From this, the paper asserts, scholars conclude that the party enjoys genuine legitimacy. In this paper, however, the authors, quote, "present results from 2 survey experiments in contemporary China that make clear that citizens conceal their opposition to the CCP for fear of repression. When respondents were asked directly, we find, like other scholars, approval ratings for the CCP that exceed 90%. When respondents are asked in the form of list experiments, which confer a greater sense of anonymity, CCP support hovers between 50% and 70%. This represents an upper bound, however, since list experiments may not fully mitigate incentives for preference falsification. The list experiments also suggest that fear of government repression discourages some 40% of Chinese citizens from participating in anti-regime protests. Most broadly, this paper suggests that scholars should stop using direct question surveys to measure political opinions in China. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful Thursday, and I will see you all tomorrow.